So I wanted to talk about a few specialty plants that can be useful. So comfrey is an interesting one. Comfrey is something that has a deep root structure and can go down and get some of the nutrients that are further down that your vegetables might not be able to access, and bring that up closer to the surface. So that's a popular one.
Where do you get it from? I couldn't find it anywhere.
I think it's often done from cuttings, but have you looked on the internet?
No, only in stores here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you might try the internet. Yeah. Let's see. Another one is mustard, which is very good at breaking through tough soil. In fact, we planted some at Little Red Hen in that plot, and I think it did okay. Right? Got a bunch of mustard flowers. So that's a good one for breaking up soil. If you're patient, there are various plants that can actually loosen the soil for you. And then alfalfa. Alfalfa is very useful in the compost pile. It is, I believe it is a legume, so you'll get some nitrogen benefit from it being in your soil, and it is a perennial. One of the cautions of alfalfa is I hear that the roots can go very deep, so it can be hard to get rid of once you put it in. So I haven't grown any yet for that reason, but I might try a little area just to see what happens. And actually that's another one that I believe we put in. Did it grow?
You know, I was away during the growing period.
Okay.
And yeah, so.
Not sure.
It
Okay.
did. It did.
Oh, it did? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Awesome. Good. So let's talk about fertility. If you go to a agricultural manual that talks about how many pounds of nitrogen per acre do you need in order to grow this crop and that crop, and then you do the math to go down to 100 square feet, which is really what you and I work at, right? It turns out that a half a pound per 100 square feet is a good number. That'll work for most crops. So the game is, how do we get a half a pound of nitrogen per 100 square feet in our soil? And how do we do it without needing to run to the store and buy a bag of something, right? And the system that I'm using is that we do that through legumes and through a 1/4 inch compost that we're going to make. So let's talk about the legumes. Fava is one of the best known ones for fixing nitrogen. It grows very easily. And if you let it go to beans, the beans are tasty. But one of the tricks is that if you're going to grow it for fertility, you got to chop it down before you get the beans. Otherwise, all of that great nitrogen goes up from the roots. In here, there are these nitrogen-fixing organisms. The nitrogen goes up through the roots, through here, and into the beans. So the general wisdom is that when you get full flower, when you see a lot of flowers, you chop it down. Those greens go into your compost pile. And what's left in the soil are these nodules. So vetch has similar nodules, actually. Crimson clover is another one that you can use to fix nitrogen. One of the challenges with that is in my garden we've had a lot of problems with oxalis, and when it's small it's hard to tell from oxalis. If you leave it, you actually really do get these beautiful crimson flowers, so it's quite pretty. Woolly vetch, I'm doing a lot of this, and I'm more and more fond of it the more that I use it. What I found is that last year I did some at the back of my plot, sort of along the fence, and I didn't pull it all out when I was pulling out other things. I left some of it, and it might be in my imagination, but I think the sorghum in that area actually grew a bit taller. Furthermore, this winter it's actually expanded and it's all growing on the fence behind my plot. So now this is interesting if you think of it kind of like a solar panel, right? Like it's making use of the fence, that's not really shading anything. And it's rooted in towards the back of my plot. And so it's almost like a little nitrogen factory into the back of my plot. It gives these beautiful purple flowers, and at some point I'll have to chop it all out from the roots. But I'm pretty happy with vetch. In fact, the other night I was at my plot and I was walking along the pathway and I noticed some weeds, so I went down to pick them out and I noticed that they were vetch. And I think what happened is that when I was planting the seeds, I dropped some, didn't really notice it, didn't really care, and it was really happy growing in the bark mulch on the path. And sure enough, I dug some up to transplant them, and they had the nice nitrogen nodules on them. So yeah, more and more fond of vetch. A little bit of vetch goes a long way. And this is something that you probably won't find in local stores, but on eBay, I'm pretty sure you can buy it.
It self-seeds very nice.
Yeah, yeah. And it's hardy too, so I think what I'm going to play around with more and more with vetch is just kind of leaving it there and harvesting around it and digging around it, because it seems to be pretty robust once it gets going. I have seen cases, not in my garden, but in other people's, where it can take over, but it's not hard to pull out. It's a pretty neat one. So the key thing with all of these legumes is that you got to pull them before you get the beans. You got to, well, actually cut them. I think if you cut them at the base, then you keep the roots in the soil. But that's a key thing. I've heard a lot of people say, "Oh, I love growing fava because I get beans and I get soil fertility." Well, you can't really have your cake and eat it too in that case. So let's talk about grains. And grains, not many people grow grains, and it's kind of a pity, because they are easy to grow and they can have these amazing root structures. So I want to talk for a moment about the root structures. So here's what's cool about the root structures is, number one, when you chop this out up here, you're leaving all of this root material in the soil, and that's going to compost. So that's going to be really nice for the soil itself. Also, as it's going down, it's loosening the soil for us. And what you get, if you do this for several seasons, what you get is you get a really nice structure to the soil, where it's not sandy and it's not hard clay, but it's that kind of nice fluffy in between that's a really good home for plant roots. And so I'm really big on growing grains. So here's some of the ones that I've been growing. So there's the cereal rye, and actually if anybody wants some seeds, I brought seeds. So you can have some seeds and you can give it a try. Cereal rye is nice because once you get it growing, it's hardy, and it gives you nice material for your compost pile. My cereal rye doesn't grow 8 feet high. This is a farm of a friend in Mendocino, but he's been at it for a long time.
How tall does yours grow?
It's getting to about here. It's not huge.
You sow that directly into the soil, right?
Yeah. Actually, I don't transplant this anymore for a couple reasons. One is it's a pain in the ass to do, 700 seedlings or something like that. The other is I did an experiment this year. So a neat thing with crops like this is there's all of this World Bank research for farmers in Africa on how to get this stuff to grow. So somebody did all kinds of research on soaking and planting depth. And so it turns out if you soak it overnight and then you plant it about 6 inches deep, it's ideal. So I did that in rows and it just grew like crazy. So if I can do that, I don't want to bother with transplanting, which is different from what my teacher does. He and all of his students are transplanting the cereal rye one by one, and I just don't have the energy to do that.
You're planting 6 inches deep?
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty deep.
Yeah, it is, isn't
Wow.
it? Yeah. And actually, I think on my blog I referenced that article. I think it was 6 inches. It's pretty deep. But yeah, this stuff's hardy, because a lot of seeds, if you planted them that deep, would do nothing, right? Like carrots, you'd never see them again. Right? So let's see. I grow sorghum, which is really fun. My sorghum does grow, I don't know, I'd say 7 feet high. This was my first season doing sorghum. And it's kind of a fun crop. This was sorghum for seed. There's also sorghum you can grow for as a sugar cane kind of a thing.
Does that require some heat?
No, it's been okay, because I don't get a lot of heat in San Mateo. In order to grow sweet potatoes, I had to mulch them with black garbage bags and then sort of water through the holes. And I still got kind of mediocre sweet potatoes, so I don't have a lot of heat. But this stuff's been okay. We might have planted some, actually.
We did, yeah, did. Yeah. How did
Did
you
it
know
get-
how it came up?
They all did really well.
You know how high it got? Was it?
Well, I mean, it wasn't
4 feet maybe?
Yeah, maybe 3, 4.
Yeah, okay, so there's evidence that it'll grow in San Francisco.
Their garden is south facing.
Yeah.
That's a nice, it has
That's
a
right.
nice
Yeah.
exposure.
That's right, yeah.
Ours is east facing,
Okay, trickier.
so it's a little different.
I've been having fun growing wheat. In fact, this year I grew a Ethiopian blue tinged wheat, and it really does kind of have a blue tinge.
Yeah.
It looked so beautiful that somebody came in the middle of the night and snipped half of it.
Oh, no.
And I didn't know whether to be really pissed off or really happy. Like on the one hand, someone stole half my crop. On the other hand, somebody appreciated it enough to take it, you know, and left me the other half. So it's kind of a wash. But that's been a fun one.
We put that in. Do you know how that one did?
I think they all did well, pretty well.
Okay,
Yeah, I planted wheat across the street, it's an orange wheat,
cool.
that's okay.
Cool. Yeah, and then, you know, the trick is to clean it. I'm actually trying to build a winnower right now. I had an amazing design for a winnower, but when I built the machine, it completely failed. So I'll have to try again.
And you're planting the wheat for the root structure, but then are you harvesting the wheat?
I harvested and I put it in bags and I put it aside for when I figure out how to build my winnower. The day will come. I'm getting close. But yeah, it's for the root structure, but also for the compost.
Well, we have a lot of wind in Diamond Heights, so how would grains do? Like I'm looking at how high those are. How do they handle the wind?
Yeah, it's going to depend on the crop. If you did quinoa, it would be troublesome. Because my quinoa, you know, lodging is when it falls down. My quinoa lodges even in San Mateo. We have some wind, but not a lot. I think the wheat would be okay. It also doesn't get terribly high.
So the ones you mentioned, which is the strongest? Like if there's one that's sort of more tougher as a...
Maybe probably a toss-up between sorghum and wheat. Maybe the wheat would be a better bet because it's not going to get as high.
Yeah, I had to prop it up.
Okay.
Oh, you did it.
Yeah. I didn't have a lot,
Mhm.
I had to prop it.
It's fantastic that you grew some. Puts you in a rare group of people. In quinoa, I've been having a lot of fun growing quinoa. I got, let's see, I'm trying to remember how much yield I got. I think on about 20 square feet, maybe I got 8 pounds last year, something like that. But we winnowed it all by hand with a fan, which just took forever and the chaff goes everywhere. Thus the quest to build a winnowing machine. I figured out how to thresh it. I made a bucket-based thresher from a design I saw on YouTube, so I have that part figured out. But quinoa's a fun one.
Have you ever grown lentils?
Not yet. Have you done that?
No.
Be worth
interested
trying.
in
Yeah.
trying lentils.
And then I'm a little bit new to this one, but Japanese millet I'm mostly growing it for the compost. Again, it gets about this high. Key thing with Japanese millet is it grows very quickly. So you can grow, maybe you could even do 2 or 3 crops in a year in Japanese millet. So one of the tricks with growing grains is that if you're going to do them really for compost, like the Japanese millet, is to do them before they give seeds. Because once they give seeds, now you've got to think about cutting off the seed heads as well as the base. Whereas if you could get them before the seeds come out, you just cut them at the bottom and you're done. So we're gonna, once I grow my grains, I use them. I use the stalks in compost, and I want to show you about that. It's really a lazy compost. I love it. So we've got our grains, which is going to give us roughly half of the nitrogen we need, and then a 1/4 inch of compost. So the key to this compost that I make is that it's layered, and the ratios are fairly carefully thought out. What I'm aiming for is a 40:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. And it's like a lasagna. It's layered like a lasagna. So the very bottom of the pile, it's these crisscross sticks. So I clear the area where I'm going to put the pile, and then I'll fork it so that underneath I get really nice drainage, so I don't have pooled water. Then I'm going to crisscross the sticks so that I can have a lot of air going under the pile, basically so that these organisms can breathe, because the smelly ones are what happens when you don't have that air going to the pile, and then the smelly organisms take over, and that's really not what we want on our pile anyway. So then I'm going to put a layer of what is known as mature material. These are sometimes called browns, but sometimes a brown can be a young material as well. But really I mean like a grain stalk that's well past dead. And that's going to be the foundation for each layer. And that's where I'm getting also what they call structural carbon, which is really critical to getting the soil texture that I want. There's this challenge that when it comes to soil structure, that, so for instance, I have a neighbor and he uses a lot of chicken manure, which is very, very high nitrogen, and straw, and he ends up with a compost which is runny, and his soil, if you look at the structure of it, it's very runny. It doesn't hold water very well. We want something that's a little more chunky. So on top of that mature layer, I'm going to put an immature layer like greens. This is where the alfalfa can be very good, or the old fava stalks or whatnot, or even you know, if you have lawn and you're not putting scary chemicals on it, you could put that on there as well. It's a relatively thinnish covering. There's typically going to be more of the browns or the mature material than there are of these younger materials. And then on top of that, I'm going to put a layer of soil. And the idea is that this kickstarts the composting process. I don't have to put that on, but I'm going to get a much more even sort of composting through the whole pile. And then I'm going to water on top of that in order to make sure that those organisms are working and that they're alive. And so I'm going to build up piles like that. I'm going to build it up and build it up. I'm going to keep it watered. I'm going to water it just like it's a garden plot. So whenever I go in there, I get some water on it. I want to keep it, you know, a nice even moistness. These piles will tend to heat up a little bit initially, not a ton, and then they'll cool down. It's a cold compost. And then you can just leave it. You can turn it if you want. That'll speed it up a little bit, but I do this in between seasons. So by the time I get to the next season, my compost from last year, or from the last season, is ready. And honestly, for me, in terms of this compost, I'm in no hurry. I don't need it to be a 2-week compost. There's also this issue that you can see in the middle, like so around the tops I get, this will be the start of the next pile, but in the middle here is where my gold compost is. It's really good stuff. So there's this issue of speed versus quality, like some people will just be piling greens and greens into a rotating container that they'll constantly be turning. You get a very hot burn. A lot of that nitrogen that you wanted to capture will get volatilized into the air. So if you just want to get rid of stuff, that's fine. But if you're really looking for the fertility, I think the cold processes do that better at helping to build the humus, which is what we're after.
Our compost is is more a worm compost. When you see when you dig through it, you can see
So there's worms in it.
there's a lot of worms.
Got it.
It's not a hot compost,
Mm.
and it breaks down in, you say, in 3 to 4 months?
Yeah.
About 4 months.
That sounds
So
good.
every month we're turning it.
Yep.
And people, you know, since it's a communal compost, people are adding things to it all the time.
Right.
And I see that you don't cut your material up, you don't,
Not too much. No. Part of it's just labor, you know.
yeah.
You're hauling a bunch of stuff in there. I mean, I do try to build it up in a way that it has that kind of rectangular shape so that it doesn't get too furry. But other than that, yeah, I don't really worry. I mean, basically you can see like the edges. This is at my teacher's garden. At the edges it'll be sort of dry, but in the middle it composts really nicely. And it
So-
shrinks, you know.
What do worms do to a compost pile? I threw some in my pile, and now they're crazy. But is that good, or what are?
It's not obviously good.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's too late now. I can't get them out.
I've had the chance to study with John Jevons, who's a kind of long-term gardening guy, and what he says, part of the idea is that the worms need energy themselves, right? And so there's a question of, are you kind of burning up some of your fertility and having the worms be active? So I think some worms are a good sign because they show your compost isn't too hot and you've got a live mix in there. On the other hand, if it's like just chock full of worms, you might be losing a lot of the fertility.
Yeah.
But it's not something I'd get too obsessed about per se. I mean, we do have worm composting just at our house to deal with kitchen scraps. But for us, it's more of a disposal issue than an optimum fertility issue.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And my take on the worms is that it's not the worms that are breaking down the organic material, it's the microbes and bacteria that are in the worm gut. And what they're producing is humus. They use some of the energy, but the humus is broken down and or it's formed and it forms a long chain organic molecule. It is very stable.
I think it's probably one of these matters of all things in balance, right? And so I think some worms in the pile are probably a good thing, but if it's full of worms, I might be wondering like what's going on in there.
So the materials that you put in your compost pile are from your plot?
For the most part.
You don't have inputs? It's just mostly from your...
It's mostly from my plot, but here's what happens, is at least at my garden, I would say over half of the people just want to take their old corn stalks, which are just beautiful material, and haul them over to the city compost bin. And one of those big boxes, and it just breaks my heart. So sometimes I go over there and I'll say, I'll take your corn husks or your corn stalks. So sometimes I do use that. When I do my garden planning, I try to plan it out in a way where I can be self-sufficient on that piece of land. That's part of the game. I didn't explain that, but that's part of the game that I'm playing. What can I grow completely sufficiently with minimal inputs? But yeah, I am using some of my neighbor's stuff, but I'm not counting that in when I'm doing my planning.
Are you excluding weeds?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That can be a huge problem, especially
So
the
it's
ones
cold
that can, because it's a cold compost, right? But even the hot compost, some things like, for instance, tomato seeds will survive nuclear winter, right? They show up everywhere. I made that mistake last year. I put tomatoes in my compost pile and they popped up everywhere. Yeah.
So would you describe this as permaculture? Or is that a
Probably
different?
not. It's not really permaculture, but one of the big things that I'm doing is that I'm doing a ton of harvesting. I'm doing root vegetables. I'm doing some greens. I think what I've seen is a lot of the permaculturists, they're doing a lot of greens. And greens are wonderful, but on a calorie basis, they just won't feed you. And I'm super interested in calories. So actually, I'm really into potatoes. I can pass this around. These are Andean potatoes that I grew. This is from a mashua plant. It's common in Colombia, and it gives a plant with beautiful orange flowers. And this is yacon, kind of a different flower, but these just grow right out of the root structure of the plant. Yeah, because I am taking things out of the soil, I have to really be thinking a lot about what I'm putting back in. But if I was just growing kale most of my space all year round, I could probably get away without doing this for a while. And I'll pass these around. These are
Is
fun.
the yacon very invasive?
No, it's been okay.
I'm growing purple potatoes and finding them a huge challenge to get out. Because when I dig down to pull them out, I inevitably chop them up and bruise them and make a big mess of the potatoes.
Yeah, I've had some. Are you going in with a digging fork, or how are you doing it?
I've ended up using my hands because
Okay.
hands I can find them and not chop them up.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, I've had some challenges harvesting potatoes as well.
But they're like gangbusters. I mean, it's just like I can see they're going to get out of control and take over the yard.
Really, the purple potatoes. Huh?
Yeah.
How big are yours getting?
I have them sometimes that big and then
Yeah.
that big and then small ones too.
Okay.
But probably that's the biggest one. I think.
Okay, yeah, it's about the same as what I'm getting.
But the plants are just kind of like Cause I never pull them all up, I can never find them all,
Right.
so they just keep going. It's
One of the
okay.
one of the nice things about them too is they're very recognizable when they start coming up as volunteers. So if you did want to pull them, they're easy to find.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Well, if you had a compost pile that was too hot, how do you cool it?
Let's see. I would not water it. Number one. I might spread it out and add more browns. Number two. And yeah, and I wouldn't add greens. But I think I basically try to rebuild it with a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio.
And the goal for having a cooler pile is to hold the nitrogen in the compost rather than let it evaporate.
You get more of a humus than I don't know, a fast burn kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. So there is this speed versus quality trade-off when it comes to how we're making our compost. And so let's see. There's really three numbers, 10, 40, and 500, and let me show you what I mean. Okay. A lot of people are making compost out of grass clippings and vegetable wastes, and so they're getting more of a 10-to-1 balance, where it really doesn't have enough carbon to give us that long-term fertility. Or I have a neighbor who has chickens, so he's doing more of a 5-to-1, and that stuff is really going to be a quick burn stuff. What I really want is a 40-to-1 with a lot of structural carbon. So you can see that leaves might give us actually a nice balance if we were to balance leaves with vegetable wastes, although the leaves won't have as much of the structural carbon as, say, a stalk would, let's say like a wheat stalk. But you can see that at least in this collection of things, we're all, you know, if we were to do a mix of these other than maybe some of the manures, we'd get pretty close to that 40-to-1. Now, one of the big mistakes that people can make has to do with getting wood in their pile, like sawdust. So you see, once we add in the sawdust, the cardboard, say the mulched eucalyptus, you're way off the charts. And there's a few things that are going to happen. One is that it's going to really slow down your composting process tremendously. Also, as you're trying to compost, it's going to be pulling a lot of nitrogen in order to do the processes that need to happen. So one of the mistakes that some people make is they'll get a freeload of wood chips and then they'll put it on their soil, and it can really, if it gets mixed into the soil, it could really slow down your growing processes. If you are able to keep it just on the surface and maybe kind of scrape it off when you need to do things and then put it back on, it might work. But you really need to be careful about getting sawdust, cardboard, or any kind of wood into your soil.
Does that apply to bark as well?
Yeah. I'd say it does.
That's the problem with a lot of compost you buy in nurseries.
Is that right?
Yeah, they contain a lot of
Like shredded bark and
heavy
Yeah.
material.
stuff the mills can't really use. So yeah.
It creates bulk, but not useful.
Yeah, it's going to be there for a while. So, as I'm going about my planning and my gardening and all of my activities, I'm always thinking, how self-sufficient am I in terms from a fertility point of view? And I actually just got my soil test back about a month ago and sent it off to a guy I know who is really into this sort of a system. And I said, I'm really kind of worried that I don't have enough nitrogen in my soil and I need to be getting more legumes. And he looked at it and he said, no, you're doing okay. Don't worry about that. He said, you have pretty healthy soil. It turns out my soil's getting kind of salty, and that might have been from our summer that we had. Although I actually took that soil sample before we had the huge rains, so maybe the rains washed that away. But that's one thing that I would recommend too, is once in a while getting a good soil test and some guidance on that. It can also save you a lot of money from putting, oh, maybe I need some bat guano, or maybe I need some this or that. Find out what you really need, and then you can get that in your soil. So that really basically covers what I wanted to go into. And I wanted to share a couple of resources with you. One is that the Master Gardeners have a free helpline, which is basically staffed by volunteers. And for free, they'll look stuff up for you. If you find a weed, you don't know what it is, get some nice pictures of it and mail it off to them. If there's an insect you don't recognize, they will